The drill sergeant's voice, a gravelly rasp honed by years of bellowing at recruits, cut through the humid air of the graduation parade ground like a freshly sharpened bayonet. Private Amelia Thompson, front and center. My younger sister, Amelia, all of 19 years old and looking impossibly small and fierce in her crisp dress uniform, marched forward with a precision that made my old man's chest swell with a pride he usually reserved for his prize-winning roses or a particularly well-aged bottle of single malt. My name is Major General Marcus Thorne, retired, formerly of the United States Army, and currently, in the eyes of my esteemed father, Colonel Harrison Thorne, also retired, a man whose primary life achievement appeared to be a spectacular and ongoing failure to live up to the Thorne family's illustrious military legacy. We were at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, for Amelia's basic training graduation. A command performance, naturally. My father, resplendent in his own slightly too tight dress blues, stood ramrod straight, his gaze fixed on Amelia, his youngest, his late-in-life surprise, and increasingly his designated vessel for all the thwarted ambitions and unfulfilled dynastic dreams he had once pinned on me, his eldest, and in his not-so-subtle estimation, profoundly disappointing son. Just moments before, as the graduating company had marched onto the parade ground, my father had delivered one of his signature verbal broadsides, a comment ostensibly directed at the general spectacle, but clearly aimed at me. Discipline, Marcus. Precision. That's what makes a soldier. That's what builds character. Not shuffling papers and attending endless, pointless committee meetings in some civilian think tank, however fancy the title. The fancy title was my current role as a senior fellow and strategic advisor at a highly respected National Security Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., a position I had earned after 28 years of distinguished, if largely unheralded, service in military intelligence, a career path my father had always viewed with a mixture of suspicion and outright disdain. Real soldiering, in his book, involved leading men into battle, not analyzing satellite imagery or briefing congressional oversight committees. My mother, Eleanor, bless her long-suffering heart, placed a placating hand on my arm, her eyes pleading with me not to engage. I offered her a small, reassuring smile. I had long since learned that arguing with my father was as futile as trying to recalibrate a faulty gyroscope with a sledgehammer. His opinions were fixed, immutable, deeply entrenched. The drill sergeant was now addressing Amelia directly, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, a hint of genuine pride breaking through the parade ground bark. Private Thompson, you have shown exemplary courage, discipline, and leadership potential throughout your training cycle. You have earned the respect of your peers and your instructors. You embody the finest traditions of the United States Army. My father practically vibrated with vicarious glory. This was it. This was the validation he had craved, the continuation of the Thorne military dynasty, albeit through his daughter rather than his errant, paper-shuffling son. Then the drill sergeant did something unexpected. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled families in the bleachers, his eyes, hawk-like and intense, seeming to search for someone. He then turned back to Amelia, who stood at perfect attention, her own eyes fixed straight ahead. Private Thompson, the drill sergeant continued, his voice regaining its parade ground volume. We have a rather distinguished guest in attendance today. Someone who knows a little something about leadership, about service, about the true meaning of sacrifice. Someone who, I believe, you might be particularly proud to have witnessed your graduation. My father puffed out his chest even further, a small, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. He clearly assumed the drill sergeant was referring to him, the decorated colonel, the man whose shadow I had apparently failed so spectacularly to escape. Amelia, however, remained impassive, her military bearing absolute. Then, the drill sergeant's gaze locked onto mine, directly onto mine, across the expanse of the parade ground, over the heads of the graduating recruits. His eyes found me, sitting quietly beside my mother in the third row of the bleachers. And then, with a voice that brooked no ambiguity, a voice that carried the unmistakable weight of command addressing command, he bellowed. General Thorne? Sir? Would you do us the profound honor of joining Private Thompson on the parade ground to present her with her graduation certificate and offer a few words to the company? The effect was instantaneous and, from my perspective, deeply, if grimly, satisfying. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through our section of the bleachers. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning, incredulous pride. And my father looked as though he had been struck by a bolt of lightning. His jaw dropped. His carefully constructed edifice of patriarchal authority and dismissive disdain for my chosen career path visibly crumbled. The drill sergeant, a man clearly not known for his nuanced understanding of complex family dynamics, but possessed of an impeccable sense of military protocol, had just, with a few well-chosen words, detonated a lifetime of my father's carefully nurtured misconceptions about his paper-shuffling son. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant squawk of a seagull and the almost palpable sound of my father's ego deflating. Amelia, my fierce little sister, finally broke her perfect military bearing. She turned her head, just slightly, her eyes finding mine, and in their depths I saw not just pride, not just surprise, but a flash of something else, a shared, triumphant understanding. The failure of the family, the one who had supposedly shirked his dynastic duty, was about to be publicly and irrefutably acknowledged by the very institution my father revered above all others. The script of this particular family drama had just been given a rather dramatic and entirely unexpected rewrite, and the drill sergeant, bless his oblivious, protocol-bound heart, had just handed me the pen. The walk from the bleachers to the edge of the parade ground felt like traversing a suddenly altered landscape. My mother, Eleanor, was beaming, her eyes shining with a mixture of tears and a fierce, protective pride that I hadn't seen directed at me in years. My father, Colonel Harrison Thorne, retired, was a study in stunned, almost catatonic silence. His face, moments before suffused with vicarious glory for Amelia, was now a mottled mask of disbelief and dawning, uncomfortable comprehension. The carefully ordered universe of his expectations had just been subjected to a significant and very public, seismic event. As I stepped onto the neatly manicured grass of the parade ground, the drill sergeant, a grizzled master sergeant whose name tag read Gunner Henderson, snapped to attention, his salute as crisp and precise as a rifle shot. "General Thorne, sir," he barked, his voice resonating with a respect that was entirely unfeigned. "An honor to have you, sir." I returned his salute, the familiar motions coming back to me as if it were yesterday, not the 5 years since I had last worn a uniform. "Master Sergeant Henderson," I replied, my voice calm, steady. "The honor is all mine. And please, call me Marcus. I'm here today primarily as a proud older brother." Henderson's stern features softened almost imperceptibly. "Understood, sir. Marcus, Private Thompson is an exceptional young soldier. Remind me a bit of, well, she has Thorne family grit, that's for sure. He clearly knew of my father, perhaps even served under him at some point. The military world, for all its vastness, is a surprisingly small and interconnected community." Amelia now stood before me, her eyes, so like our mother's, shining with a mixture of pride, surprise, and a hint of an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. Was it relief? Vindication? She, too, snapped to attention, her salute as impeccable as Henderson's. "Private Thompson," I said, my voice catching slightly despite my best efforts at composure. "Congratulations. Your mother and I, and your father, we are all immensely proud of your achievement." I deliberately included him, a small, perhaps futile, olive branch. My father's journey to this moment, this graduation, had been a long and often circuitous one, at least in terms of his expectations for his children. He was a third-generation Army officer, a man whose entire identity was inextricably linked with the institution, with its traditions, its codes, its unyielding hierarchies. His own father, my grandfather, had been a decorated hero of World War II, a man whose portrait stern and unsmiling in his dress uniform, had dominated the mantelpiece of my childhood home, a constant, silent reminder of the legacy I was expected to uphold. I had tried. For a time. I'd gone to West Point, excelled in my studies, received my commission. But my path had diverged from the one my father had envisioned for me. I hadn't been drawn to the infantry or the armor, the traditional bastions of Thorne family glory. My aptitude, my passion, lay in the quieter, less glamorous, but increasingly critical world of military intelligence. I'd spent my career in the shadows, analyzing data, identifying threats, providing the critical information that allowed others to lead, to fight, to succeed on the battlefield. My work had been vital, often dangerous, taking me to far-flung, forgotten corners of the world, to places whose names never made the headlines, but whose strategic importance was undeniable. I had risen through the ranks, not through battlefield heroics in the traditional sense, but through intellect, through strategic acumen, through the quiet, relentless pursuit of truth in a world increasingly defined by deception and disinformation. I had advised generals, briefed presidents, helped to shape national security policy at the highest levels. I had earned my 2 stars not by commanding battalions, but by outthinking adversaries, by understanding the complex, interconnected webs of global power and influence. But to my father, this was all somehow less tangible, less soldierly. He understood medals for valor, unit citations, battlefield promotions. He did not understand, or perhaps chose not to understand, the equally demanding, equally vital, but far less visible, courage and dedication required in the world I inhabited. His disappointment in me had been a quiet, corrosive undercurrent throughout my adult life, a constant, unspoken counterpoint to my professional achievements. He saw my eventual transition to a civilian think tank, albeit one that worked closely with the highest levels of government and military, as a final, regrettable abdication of my true calling, a retreat from the real world of soldiering into the comfortable, effete realm of academia and policy debate. Amelia, his late-in-life daughter, born when I was already a young captain, had become his second chance, his opportunity to finally see a Thorne fulfill the family destiny in the way he understood it. Her decision to enlist, to embrace the rigors of basic training, had filled him with a fierce, almost desperate pride. She was his validation, his proof that the Thorne military legacy would endure, even if his eldest son had failed to carry the torch in the approved manner. Now, standing on this parade ground, in my civilian suit, being addressed as General Thorne, sir, by a master sergeant who clearly recognized the rank and the respect it commanded, I saw the carefully constructed edifice of my father's lifelong narrative about me begin to tremble. The drill sergeant, with his simple, protocol-driven adherence to military courtesy, had inadvertently delivered a truth bomb into the heart of our family's complex and often painful dynamic. He hadn't just acknowledged my rank. He had validated my entire career, my entire life's work, in a way that my own father never had. Master Sergeant Henderson handed me Amelia's graduation certificate and a small, velvet-covered box containing her marksmanship badge. "Sir," he said, his voice formal but with an undercurrent of genuine warmth, "it would be an honor if you would present these to Private Thompson." I turned to Amelia, whose eyes were now suspiciously bright. "Private Amelia Thompson," I said, my voice clear and steady now, resonating across the silent parade ground. "It is with immense pride, both as your brother and as a fellow soldier, that I present you with this certificate acknowledging your successful completion of basic combat training, and this badge recognizing your excellence in marksmanship. You have demonstrated courage, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to the highest ideals of the United States Army. You are a credit to your unit, to your family, and to your country." I pinned the badge on her crisp uniform, my hand surprisingly steady. She looked up at me, a small, fierce smile finally breaking through her military composure. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And thank you, Marcus." I then stepped back, and Master Sergeant Henderson, with a nod from me, gestured towards the small podium that had been set up for the guest speaker. "General Thorne," he announced, his voice booming once more, "has graciously agreed to offer a few words of encouragement to our graduating soldiers and their families." My father, I noted from the corner of my eye, looked as though he might actually require medical attention. His face was ashen, his parade ground posture visibly deflated. The world, as he knew it, had just been fundamentally and very publicly recalibrated. And his paper-shuffling son, the one who had failed, was about to address the troops. The irony was not lost on me, nor, I suspected, was it lost on Amelia. My impromptu address to the graduating company and their families was brief, unscripted, and, I hoped, a little more inspiring than the usual platitudes often trotted out on such occasions. I spoke not of battlefield glory in the abstract, but of the quiet courage required in the everyday life of a soldier, the courage to persevere through adversity, the discipline to master complex skills, the integrity to uphold the values of service even when no one is watching. I spoke of the importance of intellectual curiosity, of adaptability, of understanding the ever-evolving nature of modern conflict, a subtle nod to my own, less conventional military career. And I spoke, most importantly, of the bonds of camaraderie, of the knowledge that the soldier standing next to you, regardless of their rank, their background, their specialty, is your brother or sister in arms, bound by a shared commitment, a shared sacrifice. As I spoke, I could feel my father's gaze on me, a heavy, unreadable weight. I didn't look at him directly, but I was acutely aware of his presence, of the internal conflict that must have been raging within him. His lifelong narrative, his carefully constructed hierarchy of military worth, was being challenged, not by my arguments or achievements, which had always found ways to dismiss or diminish, but by the simple, irrefutable fact of my rank, acknowledged and respected by the very institution he held sacred. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, then a surprisingly warm and sustained round of applause, not just from the graduating soldiers, but from their families as well. Master Sergeant Henderson shook my hand vigorously. "Thank you, General Thorne. That was exceptionally well said, sir. Words these young soldiers needed to hear." Amelia, when I rejoined her, simply squeezed my arm, her eyes shining. "That was amazing, Marcus," she whispered. "Thank you." The rest of the graduation ceremony proceeded without further incident, though the atmosphere within our small family contingent remained charged. My mother, Eleanor, was visibly emotional, dabbing at her eyes, her gaze shifting between Amelia and me with a new, almost bewildered pride. My father, however, remained largely silent, his earlier ebullience completely extinguished, replaced by a sort of stunned, introspective quietude I had rarely witnessed in him. After the formal dismissal of the company, as families surged onto the parade ground to congratulate their graduates, my father approached me, his movements stiff, almost hesitant. Amelia and my mother were a few feet away, surrounded by Amelia's equally proud and, I noted, equally surprised by my unexpected role, squad mates. "Marcus," my father began, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. He cleared his throat. That was quite a surprise. The drill sergeant. He didn't inform me of your participation." "No, father," I replied, my tone neutral. "I don't believe he did. Master Sergeant Henderson is a great respecter of protocol. He simply acknowledged the senior ranking officer present. It's standard military courtesy." My father flinched almost imperceptibly at the phrase senior ranking officer. His own rank, colonel, while certainly distinguished, was now undeniably and very publicly subordinate to mine. The irony of it, after a lifetime of his subtle and not so subtle dismissals of my career path, was not lost on either of us. "Yes, well," he said, recovering some of his bluster, though it lacked its usual conviction. "Still, a bit unorthodox. One would have thought, as the father of the graduate, his voice trailed off, the unspoken implication clear. I should have been the one up there, the one acknowledged, the one representing the Thorne family's military legacy." "Amelia is a Thorne, father," I said gently. "As am I. And today, we are both here to celebrate her achievement. That's what matters, isn't it? He looked at me then, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in years. And in his eyes, beneath the layers of ingrained prejudice and disappointed ambition, I thought I saw a flicker of something new. Confusion, yes, but also, perhaps, a dawning, reluctant respect. "Your speech, Marcus," he said finally, his voice gruff. It was not what I expected. "You spoke well, like a leader." It was as close to a compliment, as close to an acknowledgement of my worth on his terms, as he had ever come. It wasn't an apology, not by a long shot. It wasn't a sudden, miraculous transformation. But it was something, a crack in the armor, a subtle shift in the deeply entrenched foundations of his perception of me. Later that afternoon, as we were preparing to leave Fort Jackson, Amelia pulled me aside. "Marcus," she said, her voice serious, "thank you. For today. For everything. I know, Dad. I know he hasn't always understood your path, or valued it. But I do. And I think maybe today, he started to see it a little differently, too. He's your father, Amelia," I said. "He loves you. He's proud of you. That's what's important." "He's proud of you, too, Marcus," she insisted, her gaze direct. "Even if he doesn't know how to say it. I've seen it. In the way he talks about your work, even when he's pretending to dismiss it. There's an undercurrent of awe. He just doesn't know how to reconcile it with his own ideas of what a soldier, what a Thorne should be." Her words, her youthful, clear-eyed perception of our complex family dynamic, touched me more deeply than I could say. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps, beneath the layers of my father's bluster and disappointment, there had always been a grudging, unacknowledged respect for the son who had chosen a different, more intellectually demanding, but no less vital, path of service. The drive back to my parents' home in Charleston was, for once, largely devoid of my father's usual critiques of my life choices. He was quiet, introspective, occasionally glancing at me in the rearview mirror with a new, unreadable expression. My mother chattered happily about Amelia's achievements, about the pride she felt for both her children. It was, in its own way, a tentative step towards a new, perhaps healthier, family equilibrium. The drill sergeant's unexpected intervention had done more than just provide a moment of public, ironic vindication for me. It had, perhaps, shaken the foundations of my father's long-held prejudices, forcing him to confront a reality he had long preferred to ignore, that his paper-shuffling son, the one who had supposedly failed the family legacy, was, in fact, a highly respected, highly accomplished senior military officer, a general whose service, however unconventional in his eyes, had been deemed worthy of honor by the very institution he revered. The battle for my father's unqualified approval was one I had long since accepted I would likely never win. But perhaps, just perhaps, a truce was now possible. A truce built not on his terms, but on the quiet, unassailable reality of my own, hard-earned achievements. And that, I realized, was a victory in itself, a quiet recalibration of a lifelong imbalance. The old soldier in him might never fully understand the new soldier in me. But today, for a few brief, surprising moments on a hot South Carolina parade ground, our worlds had intersected in a way that neither of us could ever have predicted. And in that intersection, a small, almost imperceptible shift had occurred. The foundations, it seemed, were not entirely immutable after all. The weeks following Amelia's graduation were a period of subtle but significant recalibration within the Thorne family dynamic. My father, Colonel Harrison Thorne, retired, did not undergo a miraculous road to Damascus conversion. He didn't suddenly embrace my career in strategic policy with newfound enthusiasm, nor did he offer any formal apology for his decades of dismissive pronouncements. That would have been too much to expect, too out of character for a man whose opinions were as deeply entrenched as the foundations of the Pentagon itself. However, there was a change, a subtle, almost imperceptible, but nonetheless significant shift in his demeanor towards me. The casual barbs about my desk job became less frequent, replaced by a sort of grudging, almost bewildered curiosity. He started asking questions, tentative at first, then with increasing interest about my work at the think tank. He'd read an article in the newspaper about a geopolitical hotspot and would, rather awkwardly, solicit my professional opinion on the matter. He even, on one memorable occasion, admitted that a policy paper I had co-authored on emerging cyber warfare threats, a paper he had initially dismissed as more academic nonsense, had actually made him think a bit. These were small victories, and I cherished them as such. They weren't about seeking his approval, not anymore. I had long since made peace with the fact that my path was my own, its value not dependent on his validation. But they were about finding a new, more honest, and perhaps more respectful way of coexisting, of acknowledging our shared heritage, even if our interpretations of that heritage differed so profoundly. My mother, Eleanor, was quietly overjoyed by this thaw, however glacial. She had spent a lifetime navigating the often fraught emotional terrain between her husband and her eldest son, and this new, tentative truce brought her a palpable sense of relief. She started organizing small family dinners again, occasions that were, for the first time in years, largely free of underlying tension or passive-aggressive critiques. Amelia, now a newly minted private first class, was thriving in her advanced infantry training. Her letters and calls were filled with a newfound confidence, a sense of purpose that was inspiring to witness. She and I developed an even closer bond, our shared experience on that parade ground, the unspoken understanding of what that moment had meant, forging a new level of connection between us. She would often ask for my advice, not just on military matters, but on life, on navigating complex situations, on dealing with Dad. "How did you do it, Marcus?" she asked me once during a weekend visit. "How did you manage to carve out your own path, to be your own man, when Dad's expectations were so overwhelming?" "It wasn't easy, Amelia," I admitted, "and it took a long time. There were years when I doubted myself, when I wondered if he was right, if I had somehow failed. But eventually I realized that his definition of success, his definition of service, wasn't the only one. I had to find my own. I had to build my own foundations based on my own strengths, my own passions. And I had to be willing to defend those foundations, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it meant disappointing him." She listened intently, her young face serious. "That drill sergeant," she said finally, a small smile playing on her lips. "Master Sergeant Henderson. He had no idea what he was doing, did he? No idea he was basically dropping a tactical nuke on Dad's entire worldview." I chuckled. "No, I don't think he did. He was just following protocol, honoring the rank." Sometimes, Amelia, the most profound changes come not from grand, deliberate strategies, but from the unexpected, almost accidental collision of established rules with unexamined prejudices. And that, I realized, was the true lesson of that day. It wasn't about my rank, or my father's reaction, or even Amelia's graduation. It was about the quiet, inexorable power of truth, of reality, to eventually, and often unexpectedly, assert itself, even against the most deeply entrenched biases. My father's perception of me had been a fortress built over decades, its walls thick with tradition, expectation, and a certain willful blindness. It had seemed impenetrable, but a single, unexpected event, a simple adherence to military courtesy by a grizzled drill sergeant, had found a crack, a vulnerability, and it sent a tremor through its very foundations. Those foundations hadn't crumbled entirely, not yet, but they were undeniably shaken. And in that shaking, there was an opening, a possibility for something new, something more honest, to begin to take root. A few months later, I was invited to give the keynote address at a major national security conference in Washington, D.C. It was a significant honor, a recognition of my contributions to the field. I sent my parents an invitation, not expecting them to attend. It wasn't their world, after all. To my surprise, they both came. My father sat in the front row, next to my mother, his expression uncharacteristically attentive as I spoke about the complex challenges of 21st century warfare, about the critical role of intelligence and strategic foresight, about the need for a new generation of leaders who understood that true strength lay not just in firepower, but in intellect, in adaptability, in the courage to question old orthodoxies. After my address, as I was surrounded by colleagues and well-wishers, my father approached me. He didn't say much. He simply shook my hand, his grip surprisingly firm, his gaze direct. "That was a damned fine presentation, Marcus," he said, his voice gruff. "You made some salient points. Very salient." He then turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, a little stunned, a little moved. It wasn't a full surrender. It wasn't a complete reversal of a lifetime of ingrained belief. But it was an acknowledgement. It was a recognition. It was perhaps his way of saying, in the only language he truly knew, that his paper-shuffling son, the one who had supposedly failed, had in fact built something strong, something significant, something real. And for a man whose entire life had been a quiet battle for that very recognition, it was a victory more profound and more satisfying than any battlefield triumph could ever have been. The foundations, it seemed, were slowly but surely being rebuilt on new and perhaps more solid ground. The years that followed brought a gradual, almost imperceptible, thawing in my relationship with my father. The keynote address at the National Security Conference had been a turning point, a moment where he had seen me, perhaps for the first time, not as his disappointing son, but as a respected professional in my own right, a leader in a field he was slowly, grudgingly, beginning to understand the importance of. He started reading my published articles, occasionally calling me to discuss a particular point, his questions surprisingly insightful, his old military mind grappling with the new paradigms of modern conflict. He never fully embraced my world, never developed a passion for strategic policy or intelligence analysis, but he did, I believe, come to respect it. And in that respect, there was a new, quiet understanding between us. Amelia, my sister, continued her own impressive ascent in the Army. She became a decorated officer, serving with distinction in several challenging overseas deployments. She possessed the Thorne family grit, as Master Sergeant Henderson had so astutely observed, but she also possessed a broader, more nuanced understanding of leadership, an ability to connect with her soldiers on a human level that was perhaps a counterpoint to our father's more traditional command and control style. She often credited her conversations with me, our discussions about different leadership philosophies, with helping her to shape her own approach. It was a quiet, satisfying irony that the son who had supposedly shirked his military duty was now, in a way, mentoring the daughter who was so clearly fulfilling it in my father's eyes. My mother, Eleanor, was the quiet beneficiary of this evolving family dynamic. The old tensions, the unspoken resentments that had so often cast a pall over family gatherings began to dissipate, replaced by a more relaxed, more genuine, if still sometimes a little awkward cordiality. She told me once, her eyes shining with a quiet relief, "Marcus, it's like a weight has been lifted from all of us. Your father, he seems more at peace. And you seem happier, more settled in your own skin than I've seen you in years." She was right. The need for my father's unqualified approval, a need that had subtly and often unconsciously shaped so much of my life, had finally receded. I had found my own validation in my work, in my relationships, in the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with integrity and purpose on my own terms. And in letting go of that need, I had paradoxically opened the door for a different, more authentic connection with him. My work at the think tank continued to be challenging and fulfilling. I led several major research initiatives, advised on national security policy at the highest levels, and found a particular satisfaction in mentoring young analysts and scholars, helping them to navigate the complex, often ethically fraught, world of strategic decision-making. I often thought of Master Sergeant Henderson, the grizzled drill sergeant whose simple adherence to military protocol on that hot South Carolina parade ground had inadvertently set in motion such a profound shift in my family's internal landscape. I never saw him again after Amelia's graduation, but I often wondered if he had any idea of the quiet, personal revolution he had catalyzed. Probably not. He was just a good soldier, doing his duty, respecting the rank, unaware of the complex human dramas playing out beyond the parade ground's neat white lines. And yet, his actions had been more strategically effective in dismantling my father's entrenched biases than any argument or achievement I could have ever mustered on my own. It was a lesson in the often unpredictable power of unintended consequences, of small, seemingly insignificant acts reverberating in profound and unexpected ways. Years later, after my father had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the ripe old age of 87, Amelia and I were going through his papers, a lifetime of military records, correspondence, and personal mementos. Tucked away in his old footlocker, beneath his dress blues and a collection of campaign medals, we found a small, worn leather-bound scrapbook. Inside, meticulously pasted and labeled in his neat, precise hand, were newspaper clippings. Not about his own achievements or my grandfather's, but about mine. Articles detailing my appointment to the think tank, summaries of policy papers I'd authored, even a slightly blurry photograph of me receiving an award for distinguished public service from a former Secretary of Defense. He had never mentioned them. He had never acknowledged them to me directly, but he had kept them. He had, in his own quiet, stoic way, been following my career, perhaps even in his own _score way, taking a measure of pride in it. Amelia looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "He saw you, Marcus," she whispered. "He really did see you. He just didn't know how to say it." I simply nodded, a lump in my throat, a profound, bittersweet understanding settling within me. The battle for his approval had indeed been long and often painful. But in the end, in the quiet testament of that old scrapbook, I found a measure of peace, a sense of closure that had eluded me for so long. The old soldier had finally, in his own way, saluted his unconventional son, and that, I realized, was a legacy more valuable and more meaningful than any rank, any medal, any public accolade could ever be. The foundations, at last, were truly and irrevocably sound. The discovery of my father's scrapbook, that quiet, hidden archive of his unspoken acknowledgments, became a significant touchstone in the years that followed. It didn't erase the decades of misunderstanding or the sting of past dismissals, but it reframed them, offering a new, more nuanced perspective on a complex and often difficult relationship. It suggested that beneath the rigid exterior of the traditional military man, there had been a father quietly, if awkwardly, trying to reconcile his own deeply ingrained expectations with the unexpected reality of his son's chosen path. Amelia and I, in sorting through his effects, found a shared sense of purpose in preserving his memory, not just as the decorated Colonel Thorne, but as the multifaceted, often contradictory man he had been. We established a small scholarship in his name at his alma mater, West Point, for cadets pursuing unconventional or interdisciplinary studies within the military framework, a quiet nod to the very path he had struggled to understand in me. My own life continued to unfold with a sense of quiet purpose. The think tank offered endless intellectual challenges, and my role as a senior fellow allowed me to contribute to national security discourse in ways I found both meaningful and impactful. I never sought the limelight, preferring the substantive work of research, analysis, and policy development over public pronouncements. But my contributions were recognized within those circles that mattered, and that, for me, was enough. The relationship with Amelia deepened into a strong, supportive adult friendship. We were a study in contrasts. She, the decorated combat officer, direct, decisive, at home in the tangible world of action and command. I, the strategic analyst, more comfortable in the realm of ideas, of complex data sets, of nuanced geopolitical chess games. Yet we found a common ground in our shared Thorne heritage, our mutual respect for service, however differently defined, and our enduring, if sometimes complicated, love for the flawed, but ultimately decent man who had been our father. My mother, Eleanor, lived out her remaining years in a state of quiet contentment, her anxieties about her husband and her eldest son finally laid to rest. She delighted in her grandchildren. Amelia eventually married a fellow officer and had two bright, rambunctious children of her own, and found a new joy in simply being the matriarch of a family that, while not perfect, was at least no longer defined by unspoken resentments or dynastic disappointments. Master Sergeant Henderson, the drill sergeant whose adherence to protocol had so unexpectedly reshaped our family dynamic, I eventually tracked down. He was retired, living quietly in a small coastal town not far from Fort Jackson. I wrote him a letter, not detailing the personal family drama, but simply thanking him for his professionalism on the day of Amelia's graduation and for the profound, if unintended, impact his actions had had on my life and on my relationship with my father. He wrote back a brief, typically gruff, but surprisingly warm note, saying he remembered the day well, and that he was damned proud to have had a Thorne like Private Thompson and a general like her brother on his parade ground. He even enclosed a slightly faded photograph of himself, Amelia, and me, taken by one of the base photographers that day. A memento I now keep on my desk, a reminder of a pivotal moment, a quiet turning point. Sometimes the most significant battles are not fought on traditional fields of war, but in the complex, often treacherous terrain of the human heart, within the intricate dynamics of family. And victory in such conflicts is not measured in territory gained or enemies vanquished, but in the hard-won, often imperfect, achievement of understanding, acceptance, and a measure of peace. My father never became the effusive, openly approving parent I had perhaps unconsciously craved in my youth. But in his own way, through his quiet collection of newspaper clippings, through his awkward but genuine attempts to understand my world, he had offered a different kind of validation, a recognition that was perhaps all the more meaningful for its reticence, for its hard-won emergence from a lifetime of ingrained prejudice. And I, in turn, had come to understand him better, to see beyond the rigid facade of the colonel to the flawed, complex, but ultimately loving father beneath. The failure he had once perceived in me had, in the end, become a different kind of success, one that had perhaps even helped him to recalibrate his own narrow definition of what it meant to be a Thorne, what it meant to serve, what it meant to lead. The foundations of our family had indeed been shaken that day on the parade ground, but they had not collapsed. Instead, they had settled, readjusted, and in the process found a new, more honest, and ultimately more enduring equilibrium. And that, I knew, was a legacy worth far more than any battlefield commendation or civilian accolade. It was the quiet, unshakable strength of a family that had, at last, found its true north. The final years of my career at the National Security Policy Institute were among the most fulfilling. I had the privilege of mentoring a new generation of strategic thinkers, young men and women who brought fresh perspectives and innovative ideas to the complex challenges of our time. I often shared with them, in discreet and anonymized ways, the lessons I learned not just from my military service and policy work, but from the equally demanding school of navigating deeply entrenched personal biases, my father's and indeed my own. The importance of questioning assumptions, of seeking out diverse viewpoints, of understanding that true strength often lies in adaptability and intellectual humility rather than rigid adherence to outdated orthodoxies. These were principles that had served me well in both my professional and personal life. Amelia continued her distinguished military career, eventually rising to a command position that would have made our father burst with pride, a pride she now knew he would have also, in his own way, extended to me. Our bond remained strong, a quiet testament to a sibling relationship that had weathered the storms of familial expectation and emerged more resilient, more authentic. We would often meet when her demanding schedule allowed, sharing stories, laughter, and a mutual, unspoken understanding of the complex legacy we both carried. My mother, Eleanor, lived to see her great-grandchildren, Amelia's children, and found immense joy in their boisterous, loving presence. Her final years were peaceful, her anxieties about her family largely assuaged, her heart filled with a quiet, contented pride in the divergent but equally honorable paths her own children had forged. After my formal retirement from the think tank, I didn't retreat into quiet obsolescence. Instead, I found a new passion: volunteer work with an organization dedicated to helping veterans transition from military service to civilian careers, particularly those interested in fields requiring strategic thinking, analysis, and policy development, the very skills my father had once so readily dismissed in me. It felt like a fitting way to honor his memory and my own journey by helping others navigate the often challenging passage between two very different worlds. I often thought back to that hot South Carolina parade ground, to Master Sergeant Henderson's booming voice, to the look of stunned disbelief on my father's face. It had been a moment of profound, almost theatrical, irony, a pivotal scene in a long and complicated family drama. But it had also been a moment of unexpected grace, a catalyst for change, a cracking open of long-sealed doors of perception. My father never fully understood the world of shuffling papers and attending endless, pointless committee meetings. But in the end, he had come to respect the son who inhabited that world, the son who had found his own way to serve, his own way to lead, his own way to embody the Thorne family's legacy of dedication and integrity, albeit in a language he had taken a lifetime to begin to comprehend. The scrapbook Amelia and I found, with its carefully preserved clippings, was his final, unspoken acknowledgement, his quiet salute. It didn't rewrite the past, but it did reframe it, offering a more complete, more compassionate, and ultimately more truthful understanding of a father-son relationship that had always been more complex and perhaps more loving than either of us had fully realized during his lifetime. The foundations of my life, once so heavily influenced by his expectations, were now entirely my own, built on a bedrock of self-knowledge, professional achievement, and a quiet, enduring sense of peace. The failure he had once proclaimed was now, by any objective measure, a life of considerable substance and quiet distinction. And in that, I found not triumph over him, but a quiet, shared victory for us both, a final, harmonious chord in a long and often dissonant family symphony. The legacy of a Thorne, I had learned, was not about conforming to a preordained mold, but about forging one's own path with integrity, courage, and an unwavering commitment to service, in whatever form that service might take. And that was a lesson worth a lifetime of drill sergeants and parade grounds.